Globally, enterprise automation market valuation in 2024 itself was around 75 billion.
There's a combination of legacy systems and even systems that haven't yet been automated that are causing an increasing burden on organizations from a productivity standpoint.
It's not always clear whether RPA still continues to play a role in today's automation landscape.
From the cost side of AI, I think a lot of people get surprised that there's a significant variation even in the cost base and the cost models of using AI as well, and they definitely need to be factored in.
But more importantly, it is pushing business leaders to rethink how the work itself gets done within the enterprises. Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Tech Talk podcast. I'm your host, Soumitra Kalika. On this podcast, we explore various enterprise technology topics and emerging technology trends and try to demystify them through open and honest conversations. Today, we are going to discuss an interesting topic, something that is reshaping business and technology landscape at a lightning speed. It is about enterprise automation. Now, automation itself is not new. However, we are moving well beyond just scripting the tasks or bolting on the bots to a much more strategic capability. And with emergence of AI-based automation, it is promising to deliver better customer experience, improve compliance, improve operational resilience, but more importantly, it is pushing business leaders to rethink how the work itself gets done within the enterprises. So to unpack this transformation, I have with me today Richard Davies. Richard is he's the CTO APAC for OutSystems. While at OutSystems, he has led major customer acquisitions and expansions. He is passionate about connecting business vision to technology realities, aligning people, process, and platforms to drive meaningful outcomes. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sumitra. It's great to be here.
So before we get started and take a deep dive into our conversation, would you mind providing some more background about yourself? What engages and excites you about technology and how it impacts business?
Yeah, sure. Look, I've been involved in IT for a long time. Initially more as a technologist, as a developer, but especially in the last couple of decades, I'm still interested in the nuts and bolts, but I'm particularly interested in how to make sure that technology can deliver real business value, which is where things tend to get quite complex. It's far more than just the actual technology itself that you need to be thinking about there.
Absolutely. Now, good. So in this episode, we will explore what is changing in enterprise automation, what is the hype versus reality, what is driving real ROI, and where the business leaders should think and act now to be ahead of the game. So Richard, let's start with a big picture. Right? It's about there is as I said at the start, enterprise automation is not new, but there is clear sense of urgency at the executive and board level about automation. And when I was doing some research for this particular episode, I noted down a couple of data points. One was around market valuation. So the globally enterprise automation market valuation in 2024 itself was around 75 billion. And when we talk about the growth projections for enterprise automation, there is a much higher and healthy CAGR of about 16% year on year, all the way up to 2031-32. Now, these data points indicate that there is a very clear and strong commitment from enterprise leaders to invest into automation for foreseeable future. So, in your view, what is actually why this automation is becoming such a high priority conversation topics at executive level, and what are the key drivers for that? What kind of internal and external drivers are making that shift?
I think there's a couple of them. Again, some are sort of longer term drivers that this is part of an ongoing challenge around legacy modernization that, there's a combination of legacy systems and even systems that haven't yet been automated that are causing an increasing burden on organizations from a productivity standpoint. And then at the other end, more recently in the last few years, there's obviously been this big push from artificial intelligence. And I think it's somewhat a convergence of those two factors coming together that's really making executives think actually now is perhaps the time that we can start to really make a dent in some of that legacy and really move forward with some of our automation initiatives.
Mm, yeah. And you talked about AI, and so with emergence of AI-based automation, is it fundamentally changing the way automation is done, or is it just accelerating the old ways of automation models?
Um, I mean, there's a few different angles to tackle it from. I think um, one of the challenges with AI, as we alluded to earlier, is not actually the technology. There's a very big change management issue in
Y-
organizations around
Yeah,
adoption, and
yeah,
and that's putting a bit of a natural brake on what can be done and is
yeah,
being done currently. There are also a couple of areas that it's useful to split out in terms of where it's impacting automation. You can look at, say, individual, sort of more fine grained processes within an organization and look at how those could be modernized and updated with AI. So that's certainly
yeah,
one approach. And that's
yeah,
and that's starting to produce some interesting results. Not always positive. I think people
yeah,
are starting to realize that there are challenges associated with that. And then there's the um, other side, which is around the tooling which is being used in general
yeah,
for the whole software development life cycle in order to improve productivity, which is again an indirect but very significant boost to automation as well, especially in tackling some of those things like the legacy debt problem. So I think there's a bit of a convergence of some factors that are culturally making it difficult to adopt. That there
yeah.
are some factors where organizations are playing around with some, sort of smaller scale use cases, but there is also opportunity coming in terms of that automation efficiency and the sort of tools that organizations are using.
Yeah, yeah. And is that the high priority and highest high priority expectations from enterprise leaders that you see that productivity, efficiency are the main drivers of when organizations think of a big enterprise automation program?
Um, I think there's definitely that vision is fairly common at senior levels within an
Mm,
organization, within the
mm,
executive. There's that expectation that delivery timelines should be improving as this technology rolls out. Again, I think there's a bit of an expectation gap or a reality gap once
mm.
things actually hit the ground in implementations, that there are still quite a lot of challenges that aren't currently being addressed by some of the automation tools. There are some very interesting ones out there, some great interesting AI capabilities, but they're not necessarily moving the needle as much as the executives might expect in terms of productivity yet.
Yeah, yeah. And this has been challenge. I think this is a recurring challenge as I think there is when we talk about any AI based initiative in general. But then how do you expect the business leaders or executives think of measuring the success of those automation programs if it's not so tangible?
So I think there is tooling coming on board to help with that. So some of it again is not actually that new. We've been doing, process reengineering for a long time, and there's existing practices around how to measure and improve productivity if we look at it sort of at a process level.
Yeah.
When you're looking to incorporate AI, however, I think there are a few things to be aware of. You do obviously need to be able to track, like let's say we're dealing with a process improvement sort of more low level scenario. You do need to be able to track not just the potential costs that you're taking out from the human activities, but the difference potentially in error rates. And I think actually that's another thing about AI is errors occur in human processes. They're not just a new thing for AI. We
Yeah.
need to sort of weigh them up objectively in terms of measuring what those error rates are on both sides, not just on the AI side, and how those errors are potentially mitigated, which is again nothing new. We have exceptions that need to be managed, but then also looking at other things like on the cost side of AI. I think a lot of people get surprised that there's a significant variation even in the cost base and the cost models of using AI as well. And they definitely need to be factored in because that's often where organizations are hit by a bit of a nasty surprise that they may have done something that could technically be successful, but when they look at the overall ROI and they factor in the new costs of what the AI is doing, then they become much less attractive, or even potentially, they get negative returns on it. So that's one aspect. And the other is a little bit more strategic, I would say, which is, that's looking at a process improvement perspective. The other is to think strategically from an organization in terms of how do you structure and what kind of use cases do you target to do this automation in? Looking at your existing landscape, obviously, taking that into account, but also looking at, again, if you're going to leverage AI, looking at what kind of governance capabilities may be required for specific use cases and whether those can then apply to a whole range of use cases and what actually required. Because we find that there's often a quite significant stepwise increase in the amount of governance that's needed for particular use cases. You can start off with some pretty easy ones, and then as you move up to dealing with things like privacy and knowledge-based management, it becomes significantly more challenging, and you do need to put a little bit of forward planning into those use cases as well, I think.
Yeah. That's really great point, because these things are typically missed when you do the ROI or even a TCO for AI implementations, right? Because organizations typically focus on, okay, we need to build these models and then we need to roll those out, etc. But there's a lot more you need to do around that that is generally missed out. And so is there something here that we should demystify for enterprise leaders as to how they should think of ROI in general for these automations programs? Because sometimes, or many times, I would say business leaders think of an initiative would deliver immediate benefits when it comes to automation, but it is not always necessarily the case, right? And the other thing is, in terms of the KPIs, etc., that you can measure around automation, they are not very well defined. So is there something you want to unpack for tech leaders or business leaders on that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think part of the challenge around tracking the KPIs, look, I agree, some of them can be quite hard to track. Like, how do you, exactly quantify something like productivity? Some of them, though, I think are hard to track simply because the technology landscape is often so fragmented. Like, we know, for instance, that, take, a fairly lengthy process, say like a procure to pay process, there are multiple steps in it. Often those steps are managed, some of them outside the system, like in emails. It's those gaps where the KPIs can't be tracked, which also creates issues. That's one of the reasons why I'm very keen on the idea of having platforms that can host a lot of the solution, because they actually make those core KPIs like time and cost easier to track. And the other thing is too, so, one of the things that we do, for example, if we're migrating a human workflow to, say, an automated or semi-automated or agentic workflow, is you don't necessarily, at least while you're building the project, have time or the metrics to get a great detailed view, but you want enough to know if you're going in the right direction, if things are getting better or getting worse. So if you can put in enough control over around, say, time and cost of specific activities and some of the other key cost drivers on, say, the automation side, whatever tooling you're using, the AI costs, things like that, at least you can get that ongoing feedback. And that's also what's really often missing in a lot of projects is, having that moment, often it happens a few months down the track where things are finished, and then we realize actually what the cost was and what the potential benefit was. If we can even get something directional, even if it's fairly coarse grain during the build, get enough metrics that we know we're going in the right direction, that can be a significant help to the project as well. And that's what we focus on in OutSystems, is being able to give you enough that are things getting better or are they getting worse?
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Let's shift our focus to a bit of technology landscape when it comes to enterprise automation. And as I said again at the start, it's automation itself is not a new thing. If you recollect, and you would recollect very well, that 8 to 10 years back, there was so much hype around RPAs,
Yep.
right? And then we moved on, and there was emergence of low code, no code platforms, and now we have this whole AI based automation platforms, right? So I think there is something to clarify here for our listeners as well, because it's not always clear whether RPA still continues to play a role in today's automation landscape. Is it dead, or is we are building on top of it? And the other thing, I think there is not enough clarity within most of the listeners when it comes to low code and no code platforms. Typically, you would see these terms used together, hand in hand, low code, no code platform. So it will be good to clarify what is some difference between what is a low code versus what is a no code platform.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, to start with your first point, I mean, I don't believe RPA is dead. I think, though, to your point, it has been around for quite a while, and what would maybe class as low-hanging fruit has already been picked. But I think it's maybe getting another lease of life, potentially because a lot of the innovations that are happening in the AI space really critically rely on data, which is often locked into legacy systems, and RPA is still a perfectly valid mechanism for getting that data out of those systems. And it may not have had that level of importance in the past. So, I think there may be a bit of a reinvigoration of RPA's role in that sense. In terms of low code, no code, you're right. People tend to say it in one breath, and it's just like one thing. What I have observed over my last decade in that industry is there is a huge amount of diversity still across the range of capabilities and the sort of focus areas within what is broadly called low code, no code. There are very niche products. There are products that come often, say, from a BPM background that are now low code, no code products. There are products that come from, say, a domain-centered background like CRM or ITSM, which have now evolved into low code, no code. And then there are sort of more pure play, which is where OutSystems, where I work, comes from, which is designed from scratch to be that kind of platform. And the sort of things that you build on them are quite variable. So again, it's really getting back to the typical problem of, you've got to use the right tool for the right job. For instance, our platform is much more enterprise grade. You wouldn't use it to build your own personal website and e-commerce. But like on the other hand, you could use it to build a core system, which our customers do, and you would use some of the lower end low code, no code platforms for that. It's about using the right tool for the right job, I think, and looking seriously at what the differences are.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I think a couple of points you implicitly mentioned there, which I want to elevate a bit. You said RPA, what RPA requires was data, and that is not going away, the need for accurate data. And I think when it comes to process automation, the need for a very well-defined processes, right, itself is important prerequisite. So even if we have an AI-based automation platforms, nothing is silver bullet, as we all know in technology landscape. The foundations about having a good data landscape and good enterprise process repository, etc. Those are fundamental requirements or building blocks on which these platforms, automation platforms, will really excel.
Absolutely. And I think, but it is getting a little bit more complex as well, because you're still dealing with, say, especially in the RPA space and in the general integration space, structured data. What's really making that a lot more complex with AI is you now need to bring in the unstructured data and merge that to produce something useful as well. And that's where there's that additional level of complexity and governance that's required, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come to the governance point. But I just want to touch base a little bit about on technology front on AI agents, because no discussion happens nowadays without AI agents when it comes to AI. Do you see it is still a bit early days when we talk about rolling out AI agents for automation or any enterprise use cases? Or it is there in terms of maturity that we organizations can start thinking of rolling out agents?
So I have seen organizations roll out successful production agentic AI solutions, but I would say that the ones that have done so are in a still very small minority. What that says to me is, at least in some use cases and domains, it absolutely is technically possible. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to do it at all. But the fact that the majority of organizations are nowhere near that clearly says that there are challenges which are not broadly being addressed. And my impression is there are definitely technical challenges. So not every use case is easy or viable for AI. So you do need to pick your targets quite well. Regulatory mandates also vary from industry to industry, and they can also put a brake on innovation. I mentioned already, but I stressed it again, culture again is a big one. Having the culture within an organization, it is definitely quite threatening to a lot of people as well. AI, it's still quite new to a lot of people, even if they're not threatened by it. So, getting that level of understanding, all of those are barriers. And, I did mention it again before, but governance is still being established in a lot of organizations. And I believe that's also one of the keys to unlocking value safely around AI. And those foundations simply aren't there in many cases as well. And then, as I mentioned earlier, with the ROI, the economics may not be there either. That, you place something that's a human task with an agentic one, and it might work technically, but it may not work economically.
Yeah. No, that's bad. Yeah. Okay, let's move to, I think, on this point, move to the next topic, and let's unpack a little bit around governance, which you mentioned a couple of times anyway. because we with the advance of this AI-based technology, etc., there's definitely some consideration on how we build operating models and some pros around and governance models around this. Um, but let me unpack this from execution governance and operational governance perspective.
Yep.
From execution governance perspective, you must have come across very good success stories for large automation program implementations, but at the same time, you must have seen some failures, I would say, drastic failures as well. So, um, from when it comes to the execution of these automation programs, what comes to your mind as what is it that good automation programs do well, and what the programs which fail actually lack or miss out on?
That's a very big question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big production. Maybe you can unpack that from of the roles, operating model, and
Yep.
the maturity of the business, and so on
Yeah,
many other
e-
fronts.
exactly. And that's actually what makes it complex is all of those
Mm,
variables, which is why I'm a, a bit cautious, about what I say, because a lot of
yeah.
organizations are coming from very different starting points. What I think,
Okay.
again, as a general principle is probably quite useful is to um, have in mind and spend a little bit of time thinking about what your target state is. So you might, for instance, say that, and we've seen this in successful models, is they would operate a center of excellence, for example, would be
Mhm.
quite key to that. And in fact, when you're talking about governance more generally, the governance capabilities really do need to be centralized to work effectively. But again, recognizing on day one, and I think this is a really good example too, that if you invest a significant amount in, say, building up that capability, you're going to miss out on delivering the value that you need to keep the program of whatever you're doing going, right? You do need to be staging these capabilities. And that's why I say,
Mm,
understanding the target state is very important in terms of what you need from a governance capability, and then understanding how you're going to build your maturity map through to that
mm,
end target state is also, I believe, important, because you've got to always have a bit of a balance. The days of very large, multi tens of $1 million IT projects is just not around anymore. Business
yeah.
is quite
Yeah.
rightly insisting on value being delivered in much tighter timeframes, which I personally agree with as well. But that means you've got to be thinking very cleverly around how you lay down those foundation layers as part
Mm,
of a program, because you can't just go and lay the entire foundation all up front.
yeah.
It just doesn't give you the returns, right?
Yeah. I agree. And I agree. There's a when it comes to governance, where also it's becoming important in my view is uh, the whole concept about citizen development within the enterprises, and particularly with this AI-based automation, where end users can potentially do their own automation flows, etc. And right for within their specific operational remits, of course, right?
Yeah.
And that raises a question as to how do you balance between the autonomy you want to give those teams versus risk of creating a potentially a so-called I would say chaos, right?
Big
Where this
mess.
whole big mess where it becomes unmanageable, right? So how do
Yeah.
you balance it correctly?
E exactly, and this, again, just relating to what you were talking about earlier, I mean, this does come up a lot in the low code, no code space as well, because there's
Mm,
an
yes.
association between that technology and citizen development. Um, I definitely believe that citizen development has its place, but
Mm,
in a large scale enterprise, automation, um, you have to be very careful. I mean, obviously the benefits of any kind of effective citizen development is huge scalability. One of our customers actually, in Malaysia, large customer Petronas, they've created a a kind of a tiered model, which I think works very well, where they have a standard onboarding process for everyone from a sort of an individual contributor in the business right through to their centralized IT function. So, sort of graded levels of technology expertise and also responsibility. And they have a sort of a standard process that everything goes through and then can be effectively routed to the right level of competence. It's at least eyeballed
Right.
by a central governance team.
Yeah.
It could
Yeah.
be given to a team that's more citizen developer heavy if it's deemed to be reasonable, but it still has that governance layer on top of it.
Yeah.
And I've seen that work quite well in practice. So you at least, even if you are doing, a combination of citizen and professional development, you still need a governance process that sits on top and at least reviews who's doing what at the minimum.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe that governance process can also develop certain patterns or guardrails, etc., and standards which organizations should follow, even under the citizen development framework. Right. Let's move on to um, the use cases themselves. Right. So, in your view, I mean, if some organization is exploring to initiate a big automation program, right, and there are always use cases which are potentially customer facing, some of the back office, some of the core technology operations, etc. Right. So, um, how do you see businesses should think of initiating such programs to a point where they can deliver continuous value, demonstrate wins, and build on top of it, right? So, what are generally quick wins? Is it back office generally a quick win, or is it customer facing, or purely technology operations remit?
Yeah. Again, it's interesting. And again, obviously there's variation between organizations, but what I would say is, as a general rule, that often, as we were talking about earlier, organizations need to sort of establish those quick wins. So
Yeah.
the outside in pattern is one of the more common ones we see, where there will be a focus on, first of all, refreshing the user experience, whether that's customer or internal facing, partly because, again, with appropriate tooling and platform, that sets a good target for what can be improved within a reasonable time frame, and it
Yeah.
then sets you up well for future enhancements that often need to be done under the covers as well. So that's, that pattern has been around for a long time. We're definitely seeing that
Yeah.
because it often gets you those quick wins, and then it creates that breathing space for you to often do a lot of the harder investment around things like RPA and integration that are more complex and time consuming and costly. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Okay. So as automation expands, right, for an organization, there is always this consideration on human element, and you mentioned a bit on this, which I want to unpack a bit more, as to how organizations should start thinking about any emerging new skills requirements, new roles, etc., to make automation not a just one-off project, but as a strategic capability for the organization, right? So, um, do you have any views on that? What kind of new skills and what kind of any specific roles that you think are emerging to make this as a strategic operational capability?
Yeah, and in fact, I'm going to broaden that a little bit because I mean, I think some of the technologies and the roles that have existed to date are still valid. Obviously, with AI coming in, what
Hmm.
I'm seeing often in organizations, not everywhere, but this is probably the predominant model, is organizations are hiring, an AI team to build out the new tools and capabilities, which is, obviously, there are skills that are required in that area, not necessarily, however, deep AI skills. When you're talking about things like Gen AI, prompt engineering and things like that is a distinct skill in itself that in some ways is more akin to psychology than it is to IT development. But I think the challenge that I'm seeing organizationally is those skills are often being isolated, and that is creating a couple of problems. Those teams at the end of the day still need to have an end result, which is some kind of business application. And if they are not integrated into that application build factory, then there's that disconnect that starts to happen between them. So keeping them closely integrated into that is important. And that's one of the things, for example, from a platform perspective, we've tried to do with OutSystems is the AI agent build is just part of the regular application build platform so that teams can collaborate. But the other reason for that is, I think, not just collaborating from an IT perspective, but collaborating with the business is critical to address some of those change concerns as well. And a lot of the AI capabilities that are focused on software lifecycle are really mostly just for developers. I mean, they're tools for developers to build code, document code, test code. They're all coding co-pilots. And I think one of the interesting capabilities that we are developing is the ability to quickly generate a requirements document and a full application that the business and IT can collaborate on. I think the more that your team that's doing agentic is having conversations with the business rather than going off to one side and doing things, the more collaborative it'll be and the faster you'll get to an end solution.
And one more element about a human element, it will be good to discuss briefly, would be the whole the change management, particularly when it comes to the automation program execution and operationalizing this as a strategic capability, because people in general are resistant to change, as we all know, and with automation in particular, there is the potential risk of people building some anxiety about these changes as to whether there would be potential impact to their careers, jobs, and so on and so forth. So in a successful automation program, in my view, should also make sure that there is confidence is instilled within their employees that this is not about your roles, your jobs. It's about making our organization more productive, right? And giving you opportunities to discuss, to build something new. So what's your take on this as to how organizations should address this kind of soft angle to these whole automation programs?
Yeah, look, again, I mean, I come from a technology platform perspective, but we do see this as a common barrier. One of the, I think there's a couple of ways that we've approached it. One is you look at the work that many employees do, and you can divide it into what are relatively low value and high value tasks. And really, I think emphasizing to the employee as well that usually it's the low value tasks are the ones that, automation is targeting. And that's to the benefit of both the organization and the employee. Usually the low value tasks are the boring, mundane ones that they don't really enjoy doing that much anyway. And the high value ones are the ones that, will bring them more satisfaction and, also improve the business. So having that kind of alignment on that messaging is also is critical. The other one, and this came from, for example, we use OutSystems internally to, for instance, the very first use case, which is a fairly common one, was around support ticket deflection using AI. And we're able to achieve a significant boost from about 10% to 40% of the tickets that were deflected. Now, what that meant for us wasn't, in fact, that we had to lay off any support engineers. It simply meant that we did not have to be hiring as we grew as well. So I think those conversations are obviously much better to have upfront, that this is the goal. We are aiming to improve our automation, but if we do that, it will make us far more efficient. We will grow faster, but we'll still need to keep the people because we'll have a higher volume of work coming in. And what we want you focusing on is that high value work, not the low value stuff. That's what we're going to target.
Yeah. Many times we miss on this particular point, because There's so much an organization can do, and there is just a backlog of work that organizations can't do because people are just occupied with this mundane work, right? And with
Yep.
freeing up their time, there's so much backlog that can be freed up, and people can focus on more creative work. Absolutely. Okay,
Absolutely.
I think we are almost nearing towards the closure, but there's one thing I want to understand from you, because you are thick into the whole technology industry of automation platforms, right? So I want to understand a bit more on, and this will be good for listeners as well as to, so what are the emerging trends which are there when it comes to automation platforms and technologies over the next 2-3 years that organizations should look forward to?
There's definitely some speculation as to the time frame. I mean, I think that's the big question mark. I mean, there's, for instance, been a number of statements in the last year or two that SaaS is dead, which is interesting, and I think that's really coming from the the base belief that, productivity in terms of building code will become so efficient that you won't need that kind of foundation. Now, again, I think it's one of those things where it's definitely not the reality now. Having said that, I do believe there is more and more potential to be building with appropriate guardrails rather than just buying software. And at the end of the day, most organizations want the best of both worlds. They want the safety and security of what SaaS provides, but they also want the flexibility of doing it themselves, but without that productivity tax that often goes along with it. So I do feel there is a kind of convergence beyond. So it's really that binary build versus buy is starting to become more fuzzy, that there are solutions, especially backed with AI, that are really aiming to give the best of both worlds, where you get a solid platform, but you can quickly build extensions on top of maybe some core assets is what more the reality looks like now. That's probably for me one of the big ones, right?
Yeah. And so maybe a question on behalf of all software engineers for you. um, so so we have these low code and no code platforms which are good to develop quickly new apps, right?
Yep.
Now there is definitely emergence of vibe coding, and of course it is still new. We all know that it has its own challenges, but it is maturing. All right. Um, so vibe coding allows you to just build apps using prompts essentially. So
Yep.
how do you see evolution of uh, your platforms, low code, no code platforms, in this new world? Where do you see these will eventually evolve into a more prompt based software engineering platforms in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, they already are, some of the, more mature platforms like OutSystems are already in that space. And I think one of the areas that we're addressing is aligned with some of the challenges around vibe coding. Vibe coding can let you build an application very quickly. There's, like, you'll see Instagram posts about people building an app, a train, and they're deploying it. But it's not the kind of app you would deploy into an enterprise,
Yeah.
right? So there are a few things that really need to be addressed. One is obviously the security and the guardrails around that app. Making sure that's rock solid is really critical. And one of the areas where, platforms like ours already have, I guess, an advantage there is that's just part of the platform. In a lot of cases, if you've got a mature platform, you just leverage the security guardrails largely that are there. But one of the other aspects is integration. I mean, again, we don't want to have an explosion of shadow IT as a result of all of these vibe coded apps as well. And one of the symptoms of that is a whole population of apps that are simply not integrated into the core systems as well. So having some kind of vibe coding platform that is aware of your ecosystem is also critical. And then the last one is, and this is a real challenge, I think, for vibe coding in general, is there's already a ton of IT artifacts out there in most organizations. And talking about that problem of, how do we integrate into everything? A standard AI tool, no matter how good it is, often has challenges just getting at those IT artifacts because they're just everywhere in lots of different technologies and platforms. So that's really where I think a mature low-code platform like us has a big advantage simply because everything's in one spot. Like just having everything in one spot is often a huge advantage because you don't have to go over here for the data, there for the APIs, there for the UI standards. It's just there. So I think if vibe coding is going to see the biggest advances where there's a coalescence of all of those capabilities into a single coherent platform, and then you'll be able to see significant advances in it, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think we are almost on time, Richard, but before we go, is there any advice you want to leave with our listeners? Some of those could be senior leaders as well, as to how they should approach this whole automation programs for their organizations.
Yeah, look, I think the key messages are, have a target vision, but start small and think incrementally how you're going to get there. Think about the value that you'll be able to deliver at each stage. I mean, that's an economic imperative. Business will not support unless you can demonstrate that value. And especially with regards to the new AI world, I would recommend in focusing on communication and collaboration between teams to address that, those challenges, and then beyond that, focus on a capable platform that can then provide the capabilities that you need to underpin those organizational changes. Those would be sort of the key principles that I think a lot of organizations could follow and would help their success.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for your time today. And I think we covered a lot today, and I think it hopefully clarifies many points for our listeners in terms of how they should be approaching enterprise automation, what's coming in the future, the governance and risk aspects around this, the people process aspects around this, etc. So thanks for your time again.
Thank you very much, Sumitra. It was a pleasure talking with you.
Hope you liked today's episode. Please subscribe us on YouTube, LinkedIn, and X platforms. Also, if you are passionate about any such enterprise technology topics and want to participate in the discussion, please reach out at inquiry@enterprisetech.com. Also, please visit the website www.enterprisetech.com for more details.